Welcome to Fanshawe College. We have students here from Fanshawe today and from Western, from various different programs. And we have many community guests here as well. I'm Dr. Dana Woodstock, and I'm the Associate Dean of the School of Design. And in partnership with the Woodstock Art Gallery, we are co-hosting today in order for you to hear from Senator Bovey. If you don't know the things about Fanshawe College, this room is one of our lecture halls. It's D1060. Fanshawe has about 20,000 students currently who are full-time registered. There's also a very large number of part-time registered students. And we have several campuses. So the Oxford Street campus is the largest and the oldest campus. But we have campuses in St. Thomas and Woodstock and Seafield. We have some teaching that happens up in Lodbridge, and we have a lot of online learning going on too. If you haven't had a chance, look this up on the internet. In terms of the School of Design, we have 14 programs in the School of Design. Today we're represented by the Fine Art program, and also interior design and youth is here as well today, and maybe others who saw the notices on the library. In terms of some of our programming, we have art space education. We have strong working relationship with all local nations, with trust, humility, kindness, and respect for each other. We will remember each day by acknowledging the rich history of this land and walk softly on the ancestral lands of the I've had the good fortune in the last term since September and attending a workshop that's available to instructors for online conditions. And this is for understanding about First Nations peoples and particularly local focus, where we learn together about things that we should know or should have known, and also ways we can put action forward together. There is, I think, knowing better. So knowing better as two things. It can mean that we know better and want to practice something, so we should know better. And then there's also knowing better, meaning getting to know each other. And so we have more understanding and learning. So this is, I think, part of our philosophy. Over 200 employees have taken this workshop. And the hope is that each semester cohorts will take the workshop and know that both of these. So with that, I do want to welcome Connie Lauder, Deputy Mayor of Woodstock, and she's the recruitment of the city of Woodstock. Yes, absolutely.
Good evening and welcome everyone. I'm Connie Lauder, Deputy Mayor of the City of Woodstock, as well as City Council representative at the Woodstock Art Gallery Advisory Board, and I'm delighted to bring greetings from the city. Thank you for coming this evening to this special lecture event organized by the Woodstock Art Gallery in partnership with Fanshawe College and Western University. I had the distinct opportunity to hear Senator Bovey speak in Woodstock last night, and you are certainly in for a treat here tonight. Pat is an incredible, engaging, and passionate speaker. The gallery is selling her book, Western Voices in Canada, here this evening. And I encourage you to see Sarah, who's at the back of the auditorium tonight. And if you are interested in your copy, I should mention to you that Pat is willing to sign your book at the conclusion of this event. On behalf of the Woodstock Art Gallery, I would like to sincerely thank its partners for making this event happen. Our incredible partners are Fanshawe College, Fine Art Program, Western University, Information and Media Studies, and the Department of Visual Arts, as well as McIntosh Gallery and Western. I would also like to recognize the small but mighty staff and advisory board of the Woodstock Art Gallery for all their tireless work. Thank you for coming and enjoy the evening.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marla Botterill, and I'm the professor and coordinator of the Fine Art and Fine Art Foundation program here at Fanshawe College. And it's so wonderful to have so many community members come up here, including, folks from Museum London, Woodstock Art Gallery, Western, and Fanshawe. So welcome, everyone. If it's your first time at Fanshawe, I hope you enjoy the evening. I want to just do one shout out as well to Professor Mary Reed, who's also the director of the Woodstock Art Gallery, who worked tirelessly to get this event to happen, and she will be moderating the Q&A following the talk as well. It is now my pleasure to welcome back Patricia Bovey. The Honorable Patricia Bovey did visit us via Zoom during COVID. So this is her first time actually here, but she left a pretty strong impression in fine art before, so we are so happy to have you back. She also was very generous in spending time with our third-year studio students this earlier today and giving them studio visits, so thank you for that as well. It's a very long bio because she has done an awful lot and it is really amazing. So the Honorable Patricia Bovey was the first art historian and museologist to be a member of the Senate of Canada, and it was a position she held from 2016 to 2023. She is the Winnipeg Art Gallery's Director Emerita. She's a Winnipeg-based art historian, museologist, author, and professor. She has published extensively on Western Canadian art, including the book that we are selling here tonight, Western Voices in Canadian Art, Pat Martin Bates' Balancing on a Thread, which was the 2015 recipient of the Alberta Book Award, and Don Prock, Masking and Mapping, a 2019 Manitoba Book Awards finalist. She was the director of the Winnipeg Art Gallery from 1999 to 2004, and the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria from 1980 to 1999. And is the founding director and curator of the St. Boniface Hospital's Buhler Gallery from 2007 to 2016. Patricia Bovey has also taught Canadian art, curatorial practice, cultural resource management, and in the University of Winnipeg's MA Curatorial Practicum. An independent consultant, she assisted arts organizations across Canada with governance, funding, and strategic planning. In the Senate, she gave voice to the importance of arts with special Senate exhibitions, programs, reports, and legislation unanimously passed by the Chamber. And so as a practicing artist, thank you, thank you, thank you. Former chair of the Board of Governors of both the University of Manitoba and Emily Carr University. She served on the National Gallery of Canada's Board of Trustees, the Board of the Canada Council for the Arts, the Withrow Richard Federal Task Force on National and Regional Museums, the Eckert Gramate Foundation Board, and is the past chair of the Canadian Art Museum Directors Organization. She received a University of Manitoba Honorary Doctor of Laws in 2021 and is a fellow of both the UK's Royal Society for the Arts and the Canadian Museums Association. Her honors include the Canada 125 Medal, the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal, Winnipeg's Women of Distinction in the Arts, the Canadian Museums Association Award of Distinguished Service, the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts Medal, the Association of Manitoba Museums Inaugural Award of Merit, and the Winnipeg Arts Council Making a Difference Award. She is a member of the board of the Roberta Bondar Foundation and of Ghana's Pan-African Heritage Museums International Curatorial Council, and is recently appointed a special museum ambassador. She continues her art history writing, her work on international fraud against Canadian and Indigenous artists, and with international organizations, creative initiatives, and on climate change strategies. So at long last, we will turn this over to the Honorable Patricia Bovey. Thank you.
Marla, thank you. You shouldn't have gone through all of that. Too much. But it's a real treat to be here tonight. And I did have the privilege of talking to Fanshawe students during COVID, and I loved that time. I don't know whether any of you were part of that. Probably not. That group's probably all graduated and gone on to higher and other things. And I really enjoyed my time in the studios today. So I see some of those of you whom I met this afternoon. I'm delighted you're here, and congratulations on your work, and keep it up. Connecting through the visual arts is really, really important. And what a treat to see some former colleagues of mine here tonight and new friends of mine. And I do appreciate you all being here. But Mary, it's with heartfelt thanks to you. This lady is one of the best organizers I've ever known. And as director of the Woodstock Art Gallery, it's been a pleasure to work with you on various things during my consulting life, I must admit. And so I want to thank you for organizing this Southwestern Ontario visit and that I had last week to Kingston, and it was much appreciated. And I'd also like to thank Fanshawe College for hosting us tonight, and Western University and the McIntosh Gallery. Thank you all for inviting me here. We've had the land acknowledgement of this wonderful part of Canada, and I live in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. I speak to you tonight with huge admiration for the creative work of Indigenous artists, the spirit it exudes, both in individual works, collectively in individual artists' oeuvre, and of course, collectively as artists working across this country. Many of their works are in this book, Western Voices in Canadian Art. Before I get into the meat of the book, I want to give special thanks to the Hunt family of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation. They adopted me as an honorary family member in a very special ceremony almost 30 years ago in April of 1994. And I hold that honor with very real pride. I also want to thank Val Vint, a Manitoba Indigenous artist and knowledge keeper. She hosted my First Nations Prairie Focus Group, which accorded me the permission and privilege to write about the work of Prairie Indigenous artists. This book is dedicated to Western Canadian artists who have and have had the visual acuity to inspire and enrich society by allowing us all to see, think, and engage. And those are past artists and present artists, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, those born here, and those who immigrated from all around the globe. The resulting rich fabric of visual expression in Western Canada has been at the forefront of many aspects of Canadian art. and have contributed substantially to our national oeuvre in ways not often recognized, but which certainly deserve to be celebrated. I hope this book is even one tiny part of that celebration of their work. Studio visits over the decades have been a very, very important ballast for me throughout my career. And artists' visual and verbal insights, past and present, have been grounding and inspirational to me. My views expressed in this book come from years of looking at art and the many penetrating and significant conversations I have had with artists. So to you students, don't ever be afraid to add your penetrating views and insights into the dialogue of your time. This book was born in a heady time in Canadian art. It was the spring of 1970 when preeminent Canadian art historian Russell Harper visited the Winnipeg Art Gallery and told me, a very, very young, inexperienced curator, that I was to write about Western Canadian art. I told him I didn't know anything about Western Canadian art. I'd been on the job for 6 weeks. And he said, you will, and you will. Well, it certainly took me a while, given my various gallery and community commitments across the country, but it was always in my mind. And over the decades, I have kept notebook after notebook after notebook of studio visits. And we were talking about slides earlier. I have slides, I have images, and they're all very near and dear to me. So here this book is, 50 plus, few years plus, after the advice, the direction I got from Russell Harper. And those years were certainly rich for me in engagements with artists in their studios, at exhibitions, on the phone, in letters, on email, and Zoom. And in bringing it into reality, I want to thank the University of Manitoba Press, who believed in it when I first mentioned the idea, and who generously shepherded it along the path. I've long believed that much groundbreaking art in all media created in our 4 Western provinces spelled new directions for Canadian art as a whole. So my goal in this volume was to bring that innovation, creativity, and importance of Western Canadian art to the fore. In 1946, John Davis Hatch Jr. of the Albany Institute of History and Art in New York made what I believe are some truly interesting observations about Canadian art in an exhibition and publication that they had. And that exhibition included 5 Western Canadian artists. But John Hatch wrote, quote, "The study of Canadian art history is still in its infancy. The span of Canadian art is far greater than that in our country, the US. Painters in our country have been far more numerous, probably because of the larger number of inhabitants in the United States. One suspects, however, that in proportion of artists to the population, Canada might be found to lead. Certainly," he goes on to write, "the quality of the work produced merits Canadian artists more serious consideration and study by people in the United States than they have received in the past," end quote. Earlier, several Western Canadian artists, including James Henderson, Emily Carr, let me just get some slides rolling here. Whoops. Now, is there a reason this isn't advancing? I wonder if I can have some technical help here. Has to move it forward. There we go. Okay, sorry, thank you. So earlier, a couple of decades before that 1946 exhibition in Albany, Several Western Canadian artists, including James Henderson, Emily Carr, and Lionel Lemoyne Fitzgerald, had been part of Britain's 1924-25 controversial Wembley exhibition of Canadian art. Recently, some of these works returned to the UK's Dulwich Picture Gallery in 2 exhibitions, one featuring Emily Carr and another, the Group of 7. This to me is a very precious, wonderful art gallery in Dulwich, and one that I'm trying to work to get another exhibition in. The diversity of art from the West includes extraordinary works by First Nations and Métis artists, Blackfoot, Cree, Anishinaabe, Oji Cree, Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, Coast Salish, to name only some. Pre- and post-World War II immigrants from around the globe have added immeasurably too. First, the 5th-generation Canadians are core to our visual story, as are artists who left the West to travel, study, and live elsewhere, and return with new perspectives which enhanced the art of the region. I gave a lecture the other day in Sault Ste. Marie, and we started to talk about the role of the Group of 7 in Western Canada. And so I just thought I'd say that these are artists, well, Tom Thompson, you well know, but many members of the Group of 7 spent part of their career in Manitoba. And Franz Johnston, who painted Serenity Lake of the Woods, was head of the Winnipeg School of Art for 4 years and was followed by Lionel Lemoyne Fitzgerald. He painted a lot in Lake of the Woods and found it really inspiring to him as he tried to portray light, and depth, and space. And if you take a look at the brushwork he uses, he's got wonderful reflections and a great sense of the distance. Another member of the group, another member of the Group of 7 who moved west was none other than Fred Varley. And Fred Varley went off to Vancouver to teach at the Vancouver School of Art in 1926. And I contend that he is one of the really important painters who first brought some of the psychological issues of society around him and in his own life to the fore. And I was fascinated in looking at some of the students' work today. I commented on where they didn't use primary colors and used secondary colors. And I was thinking of some of these works by Fred Varley. But I want to go back in history. I want to go back to the first Western Canadian artist, woman, to study overseas. And it was Victoria's Sophie Pemberton, from a pretty wealthy family in Victoria. She went overseas against her father's will because it was not appropriate for young women to study art, and particularly it wasn't appropriate for them to go off to Paris. Well, she studied at London Slade School first from 1892. She studied at London Slade School from 1892 to 96, and Paris's Académie Julian in 1897. She met some of the French Fauve painters and studied with some of their teachers. And in 1897, she earned a claim in the UK's Royal Academy, and in 1899, she won the coveted Prix Julien Award in Paris. Those accolades garnered great pride and support from her father, who, as I said, had initially been opposed to her going, as it wasn't the right thing for a woman to do. I think she's a significant, have we lost the images again? Sorry. You can see when the work comes back that we have, that you can see the impressionistic approach to her work and the fact that she was painting that slice of life in this work, Spring 1902. Emily Carr, there. Emily Carr, whose work I showed you a few minutes ago, and I will later on, also went to France, but she went after Pemberton. And a lot of people think Emily Carr was the first to go overseas, first woman to go overseas. She first went to the Westminster School of Art in London, where she was terribly unhappy. And she then studied at the Académie Colarossi in Paris in 1910, and her whole palette brightened when she was in Brittany in 1911. And as we're talking women artists, I just want to say that a number of Western artists have represented Canada at the Venice Biennale. Emily Carr posthumously in 1952, Victoria sculptor Elsa Mayhew in 1964, along with Ontario artist Harold Town, and the two were very close friends. More recently, Alberta's Janet Cardiff and George Buras Miller represented Canada at Venice Biennale, and Indigenous artist Rebecca Belmore, whose work I'll show you in a minute, and she's both from Manitoba and BC, and she was followed most recently by British Columbia's preeminent BC Black artist, Stan Douglas. As I approached doing this book, it took me a while to figure out what approach I was going to take. There were several questions that I kept asking myself. What marks a national contribution? And what influences fed into artists' expression, both before and after contact? Well, contribution means adding to or augmenting the field. Western artists certainly have. Influence means to flow into. An astrological term of the 14th century, influence referred to, quote, the streaming ethereal power from the stars acting on the destiny of men, end quote. That essence of flowing or streaming ethereal power, I believe, is especially relevant to artists' influences. As Alberta First Nations artist Terence Houle aptly said to me when we were chatting one day, he said, Pat, we don't have geographical boundaries, end quote. Nor do I think ideas or impacts of Western artists' work have geographical boundaries. Our artists have defined who we are, our place, people, and societal issues. So in this book, I start with a chronological overview from the 1780s to the present, in which I contextualize major events, issues, and the wider environment in which artists worked, including the realities of itinerant artists who came west with the fur trade, traveled up the west coast with British and Spanish explorations, or went west with the railway. I found truly amazing works. As many of you have heard, as you've heard, I worked in Victoria for 20 years, and I was back supposedly writing this book, and I came across an image in a book that I didn't realize my deceased husband had. And it was this image. This is postcard size in reality. It's a 1785 ink and watercolor drawing of Haida Gwaii. And you can see the Indigenous canoe in the foreground. I was really excited by this. So I phoned a very dear friend and said, come on over for coffee. Sheila, you got to come for coffee. She came and I showed her this and she said, I'm leaving. I said, what'd they say? Right? The coffee's on. She said, I'll be back. She returned with George Dixon's journal. So in the book, I have both the piece, which is now in the collection of the Australian archives, and his accompanying journal entry about what he saw when he painted this. It turned out George Dixon was my close friend's ancestor. And for those of you who know West Coast geography, you will have heard of Dixon Strait. Well, that's named after him. And you all have heard of the Mason-Dixon line. That's the same family. There are many firsts in Western Canadian art, and I'm not going to go through them all. I'll go through a couple. For instance, 15-year-old Swiss Peter Rindesbacher, who arrived in the Red River in 1821 and lived there till 1826, was the first professionally trained artist in the West. The family had aimed to get to New Orleans. Well, they landed in Hudson's Bay. Quite a different climate and quite a different geography. Rindesbacher's depictions included the land, the flora, the fauna, especially bison and people and ceremonies, Indigenous and white ceremonies. His compositional ties are very close to his teacher, Swiss landscape painter Jacob Wiebel, and they're very evident. In some cases, all he did was seemingly change the person, but the bison really captured him. Another first in, I want to go there. Oh. Another Canadian first, I believe, was painted by William Hind, and I believe this to be one of the first two paintings ever done in Canada outdoors. I've looked at his sketch boxes. His sketch box, his oil painting box is the same size and construction almost as his watercolor box, with dividers for board to board. And what really intrigued me, if you take a look at all of this, this was built on a light ground. Traditional painting of the time, artists would start with a dark ground. And I think the light he has in here, the sensibility he has in here, the way he handled his paint has some of the same sensibilities of as his amazing watercolors. So these were two of the first professionally trained artists to be in Manitoba. The next province in the West to have a professionally trained artist, and I don't have an image of his work, was BC in the early 1880s, some 60 years after the first professionally trained artist arrived in Manitoba. His name was Grafton Taylor Brown, and he came up from California about the same time that our friend William Hind went west. Grafton Taylor Brown stayed in Victoria for 2 years before he moved on to Chicago. His paintings of Victoria Harbor and the BC interior garnered huge critical acclaim. There's one reproduced in the book, but I'm afraid I don't have a digital image of it for us today. Visual expression never ever followed, in my view, international artistic trends. Here in Canada, landscape was a pure subject in itself from the 1760s onwards. In Europe, landscape was a compositional backdrop until about the Impressionists, maybe a little earlier with the Barbizon group, of the late 1840s into the 1870s. Finally, in the 1870s, the academies accepted landscape painting as a subject in itself. Likewise, depictions of daily life and social commentary in Western Canada predated similar subjects in Europe, with Rindisbacher's 1820s treaty agreement portrayals, or William Hind's wonderful Overlander Journal. In France, such sociological interests were only seen in the 1850s and early 1860s with the work of Gustave Courbet, Honoré Daumier, and Jean-François Millet. Throughout all this, artist training really interested me, as it obviously does today, given my afternoon here. So my question that I posed myself was, did the early artists in Western Canada paint as per their learned aesthetics, regardless of what they saw? Or did their expression change in response to prairie horizons, colors and skies, and the drama of mountains and the ocean? My research included looking at international schools' curricula. For instance, I searched all the course outlines, all the course details of the London Slade School from 1860 to 1940, because many of the artists who came to Western Canada had studied there before they came. I'm not sure I was surprised with my finding, but I found absolutely no evidence of any landscape painting at the Slade at all. I saw lots of plaster painting, I saw lots of still life, lots of portraiture, but no landscape painting at all. It was the British Navy who trained many artists in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, instructing them to sketch sea views and coastal profiles. The same was true in France. In 1785, French explorer La Pérouse told his draughtsman to sketch, and I quote, all the views of the land and the remarkable situations, portraits of the natives of the different countries, their manner of dress, their ceremonies, their pastimes, their edifices, their vessels, and all the production of the earth and of the sea, end quote. First-hand observation was key, and standard instructions were for all expedition artists to ensure accuracy with no embellishments and none from memory. Some of the ship's captains allowed their artists to paint their own work in their off hours, and some of them were allowed to paint duplicates when they got back home and sell those. By the later 19th century years, Various support systems, educational and exhibition opportunities led to a new artistic coming of age. Underlining the impact in the community, the Winnipeg Women's Art Association in the 1880s and 1890s were the first to undertake many really innovative projects. When trains carrying art further west, stopped at Winnipeg CP station for a day or two, these women would mount exhibitions of the art being transported. Pretty novel, huh? They also campaigned for a gallery and a school of art, and the Winnipeg School of Art, Winnipeg Art Gallery, and the Winnipeg School of Art, the first in the West, were founded in 1912 and 1913, respectively. They became mainstays for the burgeoning Western art scene. They enabled artists to train at home, and later, galleries and art schools that were developed, they became as well undeniable catalysts. By the 1940s, the West was touring exhibitions through the successful Western Canadian art circuit. So they looked at themselves as a whole region, and the circuit was founded in 1944. It grew from some work that Ernest Lindner in Saskatchewan had done in presenting Saskatchewan and Manitoba artists' exhibitions in borrowed spaces. This circuit kept going into the 70s, and as a young curator, I curated some of those exhibitions in the 70s. And it was kept alive and augmented by Winnipeg Art Gallery's Ferdinand Eckhart, Archie Key of Alberta's Contemporary Art Society, and the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria's Colin Graham. In the middle of this, an event happened that to me is one of the most important events in the development of Canadian art. And it happened in Kingston in 1941, the Kingston Conference. And that was as a result of Queen's fine art professor Andre Beeler spending the summer of 1940 in Banff. While he was there, he saw works by artists he'd never seen before and met artists he'd never met before. He thought the isolation of artists across this country was not good. So he got back to Queen's, met with the principal, and the principal said, let's do a conference. So in the summer of 1941, the Kingston Conference happened, and attendees' travel was funded by the U.S. Carnegie Corporation. They paid for train travel for artists from west to Kingston, from east to Kingston. And of course, the Western train started in Vancouver. Jack Shadbolt was on that train, and as artists got onto the train, they all got together, and they knew what they wanted to accomplish with this conference. Likewise, from the train that started in Halifax. So this enabled Eastern and Western artists to meet each other, most of them for the first time. BC's Jack Shadbolt and Lorne Harris and Saskatchewan's Ernie Lindner were instrumental leaders in making sure the outcomes of the Kingston Conference were lasting. At their behest, 8 years later, in 1949, the Massey Commission was formed to study academe, the arts, and the state for artists. In between 41 and 49, the Canadian Federation of Artists was founded, but these artists really pressed to have a meeting with William Lyon Mackenzie King, who of course was Canada's Prime Minister. The closest they got to a meeting with the Prime Minister was a note from one of his aides that said, the Prime Minister's far too busy with matters of state and his personal life. Well, the Massey Commission was founded in 1949, and they reported in 1951, having traveled the country and had hundreds and hundreds of briefs and meetings. In their 1951 report, they called for the establishment of the Canada Council for the Arts, and they defined its desired structure. It was 1957 when the Canada Council was finally founded. 6 years after that report, and it was founded not on government money, it was founded on the basis of a couple of bequests. By the way, it was founded 9 years after the Saskatchewan Arts Council, which had been founded in 1948, and that was Canada's first arts council. So many technical developments emanated from Western Canada, including W.J. Phillips' pioneering color wood blocks, Eric Bergman's black and white wood engravings that he did from 1914 onwards, BC's Sybil Andrews, who did her pioneering lino cuts, and in 1968, Bill Lobchuk, whom I'm sure some of you know, founded Manitoba's Grand Western Canadian Screen Shop. And of course, in Alberta, Jack Snow was doing his amazing lithographs. New media and installation and performance art also emanated from the West. Pat Martin Bates and Winston Leathers both experimented with printing on plexiglass in the early 1960s. Ian Baxter used vacuum suction to create some of his three-dimensional still life plastic works of the time, and he drew attention that way to consumer greed. In fact, the Minister of Consumer Affairs opened his exhibition at the National Gallery. Groundbreaking combinations of materials and techniques within a single work were also done by Don Proch and Carol Sabiston. Nationally acclaimed painter and sculptor Gathy Falk brought performance art to the forefront. And Shauna Dempsey and Laurie Milan are part of the 2022 winning bid for Ottawa's LGBTQ plus monument, and they have contributed significantly to performance art. So from the 1960s forward, traditional norms were broken, art exhibitions toured, and thanks to Air Canada travel and thanks to air travel and Canada Council funding, artists were able to move across the country, meet each other, and see each other's work. That contributed to myriad new creative departures and leading edge innovations in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So what are some of the key messages conveyed by artists working in Western Canada? And what influences have they had on contemporary issues, discussions, and resolutions of those issues? So we have here Fitzgerald's Snowflake, Manitoba, which was a piece I found in a basement of a collector's, back in 1976, I think. And I love it. I've been out to that farm. You can see how he left some of the canvas not covered by paint. And I have to tell you that on my second day as director of the Winnipeg Art Gallery in 1999, the collector came in and said, "Pat, you found this in our basement. Here it is for the WAG." And beside it, I have a cherished piece of mine that belongs to Hart House by Charles Comfort. Charles Comfort was hired by Arnold Brigden for Brigden's of Winnipeg Limited in 1914. In fact, Brigden's of Winnipeg Limited was the largest employer of artists across the West. And you can see that in his Prairie Road, Comfort, who ended up teaching at U of T, by the way, and then was a director of the National Gallery, he didn't bother to put the wires on the telephone poles and the wires on the fence posts. He was beginning to abstract out what he felt was unnecessary to convey that distance and the horizon and the light of the prairie. So you see these two prairie artists using the sky and the horizon in quite different ways at the same time. This is Ernest Lindner, who is in Saskatchewan. And you see how he loved the undergrowth and painted that undergrowth. And this too is in the collection of the Winnipeg Art Gallery. And it's this Ernie Lindner who was so important in the Kingston conference. And this is Jack Shadbolt. This was painted the year the Canada Council was funded. And Jack Shadbolt had been a World War II artist. And by the way, as I take a look at when the Kingston conference took place, it was during the war, and it was right after the Depression, which makes it even more significant. And here we have color woodblock print by W.J. Phillips and Red River, black and white wood engraving by Eric Bergman. These two people brought these media to Canada. Pat Martin Bates with her work on plastic. She printed on this. This is 5 tiers that are, as you can see, are exhibited one ahead of the other. And she was really interested in the spiritual work of Eastern religions. And so here we have Light Window of the Alchemy Letter from the Sun to the Moon. And here is one of Ian Baxter's vacuum pieces, which is in the collection of the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria. And when we get into performance art, here's here's Shauna Dempsey with her arborite house dress, where she's discussing the traditional roles, unfortunate roles of wives at home. And we see the performance piece that she and Laurie Milan did first performed, the Lesbian Rangers first performed in Banff. So now I want to move to the second half of my book, which I really enjoyed writing. I examine specific themes from multiple perspectives, each which cross geographical boundaries and multiple decades and alert society to critical issues. In a minute, I'm going to show you Joan Cardinal Schubert's late 1980s installation, The Lesson, which shone light on residential schools long before the TRC, just as Fred Varley and Charles Comfort's war pieces had portrayed the devastation of World War I and World War II. In my section on landscape, I look at its landscape as culture, history, place, and spirit. I include the rise of cities, which was a very important aspect of Western Canadian art as rural areas became urban areas. And Fitzgerald and Wilf Perot from Saskatchewan are two artists whose work centered around back lanes. Tad Suzuki, Bill Pura, and Andrew Volko explore urban lights and reflections. But my exploration of the land, which is a core element of culture, really also encompasses the spiritual in the generation of a number of artists' works. Winnipeg's George Swinton emigrated from Austria before the Second World War. He changed his name. He changed his religion from Judaism to Christianity. When they arrived in Canada, he and his mother and his one brother owned what is now Green College at University of British Columbia. He then came, and after several stops on the way, he ended up being a professor at the School of Art in Winnipeg. And in my research for this book, he was one of the professors who came to the fore as being one of the most important teachers of painting in Canada. It was George who brought Inuit sculpture down from the north, along with Jerry Toomey. It was George who was on commissions up to the north to see how to get business going in the north. But throughout it all, in his own painting, he really had a spiritual quest. And that's seen through his treatment of line, his lines through the work, his color. And again, he uses that green, that acrid green that we see in so much of Varley's work. And we see the spirit and the movement across that landscape, across the birth of a prairie river, right to the horizon and the sky with the same colors of the land, but a completely different brush treatment. BC's Lauren Harris, member of the Group of Seven, he became very interested in theosophy. Jason McBride wrote in an article in 2016 in the Toronto Life titled The Mystic, quote, "United by romanticism, mysticism, and their outsized egos, the group, painters Tom Thompson, Harris, and several others, proudly proclaim themselves to be emissaries of a new art movement," end quote. This group painted in Toronto, as you know, and then went out into the bush all across Canada. After World War I and the 1917 death of his good friend Tom Thompson, Harris was very depressed and became really intrigued with spiritualism, and in theosophy, that became his lifeline. McBride continues in this article, quote, "Theosophy had no rituals per se. Practicing it basically meant getting together with other theosophists and talking about it. They believed artists had gone through several reincarnations to become more spiritually involved. Attuned to a higher reality, they could communicate their enlightenment to the rest of the world. And if their visions were too original, too experimental, too vanguard, it's only because the rest of society wasn't as involved as they were," end quote. Harris loved theosophy's epic sweep, and he loved the sense of possibilities it gave to his painting. He wrote, "Theosophy is no soporific like an ordinary religion. It excites all sorts of things, unknown and untoward things." Harris went to the Toronto Theosophical meetings, and those meetings fed his belief of the Great North. And he wrote, "We are on the fringe of the Great North, and its living whiteness, its loneliness, replenishment, its resignations and release, its call and its answer, its cleansing rhythms." He traveled to Algoma within a month of getting out of the army, and there he pulled himself together. I think you can see in this painting on your left, images like Cloud Lake Superior that he simplified his compositions in color, and this glacier blue and his whites almost became his trademark, which you can also see in his 1924 work of Malign Lake Jasper. His shapes began to assume an increasing sculptural quality. He and his second wife, Bess, left Toronto and moved to Mexico, where they were involved with Theosophers. And later, when they were living in Vancouver, every Sunday night, he held musical evenings with other artists. That is, until his record collection was stolen. I interviewed many artists who had gone to those Sunday night discussions and asked them whether Theosophy was discovered or not. I was really trying to figure out how much this directed his Vancouver life. Well, I got different views, completely different views. John Kerner said yes, Jack Sadbolt said no, and it ended up, when I finished talking to as many of them as I could find, it was 50-50. So and they all went together on Sunday nights. So you can decide whether Theosophy was discussed or not, because I don't know. What we do know is that he introduced Emily Carr to Theosophy. And she had many discussions with him about the spiritual in art. She forsook Theosophy, saying it was far too intellectual for her. Throughout her art, through her forests and works like this overhead, her coastal works and her skies, she was in constant search for light, or as she said, the spirit or God, as she referred to it often in her journals. Her writing about her search for light and her search for the spirit are really fascinating. She always felt the real gods were in the forests, not cooped up in a church. She said God's not in a church with the doors shut. God's outside. And her brushwork carries your eye up in that search for the light. And she uses parallel brushworks in a lot of her paintings. And the tree trunk, and the one in the middle, in Somberness Sunlight, she handles that tree trunk very much the same way she handled the dress, the sleeve of her dress, in her own self-portrait that same year. So I believe that through her brushwork and through her color, she conveys a spirit in a way no other Canadian artist has. And then, of course, we move forward. And we have Robert Hoole's Where the Gods Are Present, and that's the image on the cover of this book. It depicts his spiritual space. And I know he lives in Toronto. I know he's worked in the East, but he was born in Sandy Bay, Manitoba, and he went to school in Sandy Bay. And so this is his spiritual place. And he talks about it as reappropriating and reclaiming Manitoba with its symbolic colors represented in the four directions. Hoole told me when I talked to him one night, quote, "This place was the object of a pilgrimage for the native people in the area," referring to a specific spot on a narrow stretch of a lake where the current ebbs and flows. As the water hits the porous limestone of the shore, it makes a muffled drone resembling the faraway sound of drums. Hoole has to be one of the more spiritual painters I've had the opportunity to work with. But there are other First Nations artists who share the spiritual in their work, including Manitoba's Colleen Cutchell's Milky Way Spirit Trail and BC Robert Davidson's Supernatural Eye, a copy of it being a sculpture, being in the National Gallery of Canada. Their work is equally important and barrier breaking. The Regina Five was a critically important group in Canadian abstraction. In fact, I believe they really led it in many ways, even though in the 1920s, Bertram Brooker was painting Sounds Assembling and Hallelujah, and is generally thought to have been considered the first abstract artist in Canada. When Bertram Brooker was managing a theater in Neepawa, Manitoba, he said, "If ever I paint, I want to paint music." And I think he did that in these. But the Regina Five, we have artists who, some of them came back to Manitoba, or came back. Ken Lockheed came to Manitoba. Some of the others came back east. But the Regina Five had a major exhibition in 1962 in Regina and then at the National Gallery of Canada. And that exhibition garnered international critics and curators' support. Doug Morton worked in all 4 provinces of the West. He went to school at Kelvin High School in Winnipeg. He was Regina 5 teaching at the University of Regina. He was head of the School of Art. He was head of the College of Art in Calgary, and he was Dean of Fine Arts at the University of Victoria. Then I have a section on portraits and inscapes where I discuss varying approaches of artists in commissioned and non-commissioned portraits, including 3-dimensional works like this one by Richard Hunt, who's his Chief's Wild Woman, in which he's honoring his ancestors. And it's his work that has recently been forged by a ring in Eastern Europe, which is a piece of work I'm undertaking now. But I also examine issues of what I call psychological inscapes. Mathanwi Pavlik, Victoria artist, did these wonderful drawings in 1968, sensitive pencil and charcoal drawings, really reflecting her own personal situations. They had a really very difficult time. And Richard Chichamara, who emigrated to Canada from Austria after the Second World War, did these amazing wood collages where the figures don't look at each other. They don't have faces. Or in his paintings, he'll have a red line right across the front. Richard Chichamara's works are lonely, they're haunting. And then another artist who's done penetrating psychological work, I believe, is Winnipeg's Eva Stubbs, who escaped Europe before, I guess in the late 1930s. And incidentally, the person who got her the false papers, her family's the false papers to get out of Europe, was the very same person who got the artists out from who were escaping Nazism in Villa Herbel in Marseille. So simultaneously, personal and universal, each of these artists and others open shutters on intense human psychological frailty. The last chapter of the book looks at visual voices raising societal concerns, and this links to much of my Senate work. The Environment and Climate Change investigates the effect of clear cuts to the impacts of permafrost melt. Emily Carr, with her late 1930s logged over works, was I believe, the first artist to be outspoken about environmental issues, and as you know, many have since. Visual artists also have given really constructive insights into issues of reconciliation, colonialism, residential schools, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And I believe these works need to be seen, listened to, and acted on. Ruth Cuthand, Saskatchewan artist, beadworks called Trading Series from 2008 forward show microscopic forms of all illnesses. She did one of COVID-19 as well. All the post-contact diseases are done with glass beads, referring to the history of trade beads. The one pre-contact disease, syphilis, she did with traditionally dyed naturally dyed quill work. And this links to a piece I don't have a reproduction for, Trace by Rebecca Belmore. Rebecca Belmore did the 4-story clay hanging in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. It hangs like a blanket on a peg or a towel on the back of a bathroom hook, a bathroom door. And when you look at it, towels and blankets evoke warmth and coziness. Well, in fact, it was blankets that spread smallpox, nearly wiping out many Indigenous communities across the country, almost wiped out Haida completely. So this really refers to the Hudson's Bay blanket, and there's a dichotomy between what we normally think of a blanket and disease. Saskatchewan's Bob Boyer also took a look at blankets and the disease that was spread at contact. And I believe his blanket works are visceral condemnations of colonialism. And actually, they preceded Ruth's Trading Series and Rebecca's Trace. And thus, I think he was one of the first really direct and unsettling expressions raising societal concerns of colonialism. I mentioned Joan Cardinal Schubert a minute ago. Residential schools and reconciliation were highlighted, particularly by people like Alberta's Joan Cardinal Schubert. She was a very early leader in this subject, as was Art Thompson. Cardinal's installation, this one, was done long before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As you can, we exhibited at the Art Gallery Greater Victoria in the 1980s. It's set up as a classroom, took over a whole gallery, set up as a classroom with a chalkboard on each of the two walls. The writing on one is an oppressive liturgy. The writing on the other is a poignant memory wall, and visitors to the installation are invited to add their stories. Each edition making each detail more horror-filled. The black classroom chairs are in rows and they're tethered, which of course talks about the strictness of the system. A dunce's cap is on the stool at the back. A red apple is skewered to each seat, and during the time of the exhibitions, the apples turn brown and get rotten. This brutally honest installation, in my view, embraces and exposes the truth, and at the same time reaffirms the power of the human spirit. I think this is, I know this has been seen in other places, but I think this is a really, really important piece. Another artist that foreshadowed the need for us to be talking about residential schools was BC's Art Thompson. And I'll be forever sorry that he passed away before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established, as it was he in 1981-82, I can't remember which. We were installing a show of his, and he arrived at the gallery with his daughter, Emily. And Emily wanted to climb a ladder and move lights around. So we were all set for that. And Art said, "Can I talk to you?" We went up to my office, and 2 hours later, we emerged. I don't know how many boxes of Kleenex we went through. Art told me everything that happened to him in the Port Alberni residential school. His subsequent work usually includes a circle, referring to a coming back. And his works are full of rhythm, and they're done with traditional Kwakwaka'wakw iconography. Lots of movement in them. And I have to ask, is that movement a movement forward to reconciliation or a movement backwards to memory? Another work dealing with residential schools is this amazing piece by Robert Hoole called Sandy Bay. And in my view, I think this is one of the most important pieces in Canadian art. You can see his traditional use of color, that green line that features in so much of his work. But in that main panel, we have the portrait of Sandy Bay Residential School. And he talks about the day they came to take him, his brothers, and his sisters away from the family. The sisters went in one door, the brothers in another. They never saw each other at school. Their recesses were at different times. He told all this to our staff. Recesses were at different times. They couldn't eat together. They couldn't meet. You'll see that the windows are veiled. There are no doors. And there's one window for each of his siblings. In the front of it, the whole piece is veiled. We have a portrait of the priest he liked, a photograph, and we have a photograph of his younger sister's confirmation class. Years later, during the hearings for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, his own truth came out. He buried his truth, and he did an amazing series of drawings, which I think they're now, thanks to Mary, in the collection of the University of Manitoba, and it got the York Wilson Prize. But he did one watercolor drawing a day, and many of them have really horrifying words on them. And with those drawings, he said, "I built my bridge." He'll never forget it. And I say, as we look at all this work, we need to be building our bridges. Faye Heavyshield and Arthur Vickers both look at family in a different way. Arthur Vickers' wonderful this is a huge piece, Intangible Heritage, talks about his ancestors. And if he were here, and if we had more time, I would tell you what each of those symbols are about. This is another subject that I'm about to start writing on. But Faye Heavyshield's sisters, I think, is really interesting. She didn't do this because of murdered and missing women, but there are 6 sisters in her family. And so here we have 6 pairs of gold shoes arranged in a circle, all high heels, toes pointing out, referencing the fact of sisters coming together, shielding each other. And I contend, in what we know now, one can only imagine why. And as I said, this is not originally done in response to murdered and missing women and girls, but you can see how key I think this is to those particular reflections. Internationally lauded Alberta artist, First Nations painter, collage artist, and printmaker, Jane Ash Poitras, in her canvas-filled works, depicted Indigenous history, spiritual beliefs, individual lives of First Nations people. Her visual directness empowers Indigenous nations at the same time as unsettling viewers who are ignorant of the history. Her highly detailed compositions elucidate decades of difficult, often buried histories. Her works are consistent in imagery and composition. Rich and meaningful images fill every centimeter of every canvas. Her works are divided into segments, sometimes vertically, sometimes horizontally, sometimes both. They tell multiple stories at the same time, stories past and stories present. They tell multiple situations, cover multiple time frames, as I said. Often they include personal photographs, and they always include Indigenous symbols and calligraphy. The ephemera, as she calls it, includes collage clippings, photographs, sometimes a stamp, usually letters of the alphabet or words, and they often reference Hudson's Bay Company blankets. In many works, I guess not this one, in many works, you'll see the stripes of the Hudson's Bay blankets across the bottom. I've had amazing conversations with her. And in many of her works, blackboards or black backgrounds depict, quote, in her words, the idea of the residential school, and turned it into something positive for our history. She emphatically and rightly recognizes that, quote, art is a healing process and a sacred act. All her paintings, in my view, hold hope for the future. After the residential school burial findings, I had a conversation with her, and I said, how are you feeling? Well, I guess I phoned her the night of the first finding. I said, how are you feeling? How are you holding up? And she started that night to discuss the depth of her iconography and their overall meanings. Throughout her work, she underlines the fact through her iconography that for years, the fact that bodies were buried on all these sites was known. And as she said, bones are depicted in many of my works over many, many years. And so we have to look at her works as prophetic in some ways and historic in other ways. Also emanating from the residential schools were issues of racism. And there was an article a few years ago in Time magazine that Winnipeg was the most racist city in the country. Casey Adams, Indigenous artist, wasn't going to let that go. So she developed her perception series. And in her perception series, there are 2 works. This is one work, but there are 2 photographs making a diptych. She asked for volunteers to get in touch with her to be photographed. And she asked them to say, think about the worst things they've been called and what do you look like? And the words were put on the top. And then the bottom of each one said, look again. And here's herself. The second side, she asked them to smile. and think of what they'd accomplished. And at the top are the accomplishments. These works were not shown in any gallery. They were shown out on the street. They were in bus shelters. They were on billboards. They were on banners. They were all around the city, basically saying, folks, we've got to deal with this. I was at an event last weekend with Brian Bowman, former mayor of Winnipeg. And he said, you know, Pat, when that article came about Winnipeg being the most racist city, he said, I felt sick. I felt so pleased a year later after this, when Time magazine said Winnipeg is the least racist city. So I want to thank my dear friend, Casey Adams. There are other issues that have been discussed. We have murdered and missing women with Jamie Black's Red Dress Project. This has taken on globally. She did this really as a spirit to friends that she had lost. Well, now, you know, I'm sure it happens here. It certainly happens across the West. It happens in London, England. It happens everywhere that people hanging red shirts or red dresses on their trees, in their windows, on their doors. And it's a mark of respect and a mark of concern for those that were lost. And then there are the issues of 60 Scoop. This piece by Joseph Tisica, who worked he's in the South now, but worked in Yukon. This is his mother's story that he's painted of when she was taken away as a little girl at 60 Scoop. You see the police car, you see the strange man at the door, you see the tent with the Hudson's Bay stripes, and you see the children hiding in that tent. I think this is an important piece and a really interesting one. This got him the Sobey Prize. And then, of course, there are the issues of water and the lack of water in First Nations communities. And this one of Mishupeshu and the Water Spirit is by Robert Houle. And I love the fact that you see the divining rod of the shaman of Mishupeshu, and he's got the bison horns. The shaman was one that for some people meant danger and for other people meant hope. And that yellow background that Robert has used, I think, gives sense of hope. Terence Houle did this work for the O'Canada exhibition in Massachusetts that has been exhibited other places. And it's a decal on the wall of a bison with oil pouring down the wall. And in some of the installation, there are little oil cans from our cars at the bottom. And as he talks about this, he talks about how the First Nations have had to learn to live without the bison. The bison were their clothes, their home, their culture, their spirit, their food, and contact took the bison away from them. And his line with this is, we're all going to have, and he said, we survived. We learned how to live differently. And he says with this one, now we're all going to have to learn differently without oil. And I think it's interesting to put this together with Don Proch's Rocky Mountain mining mask that you see the railroad track going through the eyes and around and around and around. Not long after he did this, there was, of course, a huge railway oil spill in the Rocky Mountains, in the same province where Terence Houle did his piece. And so as we look going forward, we take a look at the one on the right by Rosalie Fable. I woke to find my spirit had returned. And we all know that Louis Riel said, we will sleep, my people will sleep for 100 years. And when we awake, our artists will lead us. And I think that's exactly what has happened. Rosalie was I'm going to say a victim of the 60s scoop. And she knew she was different, but it wasn't until she was older. This was a birthday picture of hers. She first did it and called it assimilation, and then she changed the title to a simulation. And she said, I was older when I found this picture in the family album. And that's when I realized why I was different and who I am. And she's spent a lot of her career, obviously, taking a look at the taking a look at her culture and where she's at. And it's strong work. She's teaching at Ottawa University, and I think she's another who looks back by looking forward. The one who really looks forward, and I'm going to pick up the page that fell. The one who really looks forward is Val Vint. This is by the artist who gave me the opportunity for that first workshop. This is a piece of public art at the Forks in Winnipeg. It's made of steel books and films by Indigenous authors, and some by allies. Most of them are Indigenous. And when you see it put together, it's amazing. How old some of these, how long ago some of these were published, and how recent some of them are. And the bison looks over the river to the grave of her grandfather. And she cited this with the same plants that she planted in her grandfather's grave. And she talks about this being really important because not so much for what it says, but for how people get together. And she talks about the conversations that are taking place at this piece. Education is a new bison. She talks about the fact that when we sit down and talk to each other, we're looking in each other's eyes. And when we look in each other's eyes, there are no others. And I think that's a very strong message to go forward. And of course, Murray Sinclair, the commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the first Indigenous judge in Manitoba, a good friend of mine. In fact, he's the one who walked me into the Senate chamber the day I was inducted into the Senate, and he sat behind me. And you know, his line is, education got us into this mess and education will get us out of it. And there are 3 open books on Val's piece. One is Murray Sinclair's comment, education got us into this mess, education will get us out. One is a piece, a quote from Robert Davidson, Northwest Coast artist, where he says, our future is our traditions. And another is Louis Riel's, when my people will sleep for 100 years and when we awake, our artists will lead us. So I feel very strongly that the seminal contributions of Western artists, whether they were born here or not, whatever their cultural diversity is resulted in myriad influences, which include those from elsewhere, artists' own personal experiences and places, their times, contemporary and past art practices, and the defining aspects of culture, politics, and ideas. Art, in its complexity, reveals our truth as to who we are, where we live, and how we adapt. To reach the collective societal goal of reconciliation, I believe we need to achieve multiple reconciliations. And the core of those reconciliations must be the understanding of the meaning of culture. Visual art is the pillar of culture, all cultures, music and movement being the other 2 international languages that transcend geography, time, age, and words. So in conclusion, I want to quote artist Maxwell Bates. This Alberta and British Columbia expressionist figure painter was one of the founders of Victoria's Limner Society of Artists, a very important international group of artists in Victoria. Max went over to England before the Second World War. He was working for his father, who was an architect in Calgary. He wanted to get away. He started to work in London, and then war broke out, and Max joined the British Army. He was a prisoner of war, a German prisoner of war for most of World War II, and he did forced labor in the salt mines. And the demeanor and changing physiques of his fellow prisoners are clearly evident throughout much of his work, and those years haunted him and fed his themes of clowns and beggars throughout his work. In his 1962 book, Faraway Flags, he wrote, I am an artist who for 40 years has stood at the lake edge, throwing stones in the lake. Sometimes very faintly, I hear a splash. His splash was far greater than he realized. I hope this volume may at least be a faint splash in celebrating Western Canadian artists. May its pages open art readers to the rich extent of pioneering work from the West, and encourage artists to continue breaking barriers of visual expression, and others to write about that which space precluded in this book. And if this book has any overriding message at all, it is to listen to the visual voices of artists. It is our artists, and especially our Western artists, who tell us so poignantly through their visual voices who we are, what we must cherish, and what we must address as a society. Art is at the core in understanding and addressing all contemporary issues fairly and openly. And as far as reconciliation is concerned, everyone needs to be at that table for society to move forward. So I'm going to say thank you, and I'm happy to address any questions.
Thank you so much, Pat. That was such a wonderful, informative, and actually very moving lecture. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mary Reed. I am a sessional faculty member here at Fanshawe College, and my day job is running the Woodstock Art Gallery. So Dana and I are going to tag team the Q&A. She's going to be doing with the Zoom questions, and I'll also be doing with you guys in the mic, live here and passing the mic along. Because we are live streaming it, I'd ask that if you have a question to raise your hand, and I'll pass the mic to you so you guys can speak into that, and then Pat can respond. But before I do that, I do also want to remind you that tomorrow, Senator Bovey will be giving a workshop on art activism and cultural policy through the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, which will be moderated by Dr. Sarah Smith. So if you're still really eager to listen to what Pat has to talk about on a totally different topic, you can certainly join us over at Western University at 10 a.m. And it's in the FIMS and Nursing Building in room 4130. So that's at 10 a.m. tomorrow at Western. So does anybody have a question for Senator Bovey to start us off for the evening? Don't be shy. I know some of your names. I will call you out. Great.
A group of us in class the other day read the intro and the beginning part of your book. And one of the questions my group had was, which Indigenous group started the practice of birch bark biting, and when and how long ago?
Oh, that's a good question. It was prairie artists. The ones doing it today, the artists practicing it today are Métis artists. And it is a tradition that dates, I can't tell you the date. I know it was certainly strong in the 19th century, probably predated that. I was unable to find examples of the old pieces in reproducible condition. There are some of the very early ones in the Musée Saint-Boniface in Winnipeg. There's some in the Manitoba Museum, and I'm sure there's some in Saskatchewan, but I was really sort of looking closer to home. But it is a long, long practiced tradition.
Thank you so much for that question. Was there anybody else who had a question for Senator Bovey? Okay, great. I'm going to get my steps in tonight.
So I'm also a part of the class that we had some prepared questions. I read the intro to your book, and you didn't mention them during your lecture here, but they were mentioned, the Professional Native Indigenous Artists Incorporated, or Inc. I can't remember if it's incorporated or not. But they're very often referred to as the Indigenous Group of Seven. And I was very curious about why that is the title that they've been called under, especially because of the fact that they're not very similar in style to the Group of Seven or anything like that. So I was confused as to why there wasn't a bigger push to refer to them by the title that they chose at the time.
The original title was, quote, the Indian Group of Seven. And of course, with issues around reconciliation, and when the major recent exhibition was done of their work, that's when they were published as the Indigenous Group of Seven. I met Daphne Ojic back in 1972 when they started, met her in a kitchen in Winnipeg. And I knew many members of the Indigenous Group of Seven. And we at the Winnipeg Art Gallery gave them their first exhibition in 1972. So we were able to exhibit them the year they were formed. Why the seven? They wanted to be seven. I think they felt that the other group of seven had done so well by being a group in terms of getting interest in their work, sales of their work, and coverage for their work. They thought that was something that they could carry forward and do the same. They were great friends. And yes, their work is different from each other. But I'm going to say, if you look at it closely, you will find there are overlaps of interest in their work, especially the way they come after the spiritual and the what's the word I want? Their past stories and shaman and the X-ray views, interior views, and the meaning of those interior views in so many of their works. Most of them did that one way or another in some of their works, but they were very close friends. I had lunch last summer before last, with Jackson Beardy's widow, Paula. And we talked about this, and I asked her not quite the same question, but much the same question. And I think they were pretty pleased to be able to change their name, have the name changed, that they agreed with it. I'm giving a lecture next week at UVic where I'm really talking about Indigenous work and how this work can lead to reconciliation. And I have to say, Andrew, were you still at the WAG when we did when the Indigenous Group of Seven show was there? It was an amazing show. And what I loved about the opening was the fact that Jackson Beardy's grandson was one of the dancers.
Wonderful questions. Anybody else have a question for Senator Bovey? Oh, Andrew. Andrew's another former Wagoneer. Our offices used to be beside each other. I did.
Yeah, some of us in the West have lost major people to the East. So don't think I'm not geographically biased.
Two-part question,
Yeah.
And thank you, Senator Bovey, for this wonderful presentation here in the East on Western Canadian art. First part, why has this book not been written yet? Not by you, but just in general. Why did it take this long to kind of see a book like this come to fruition? And secondly, kind of related, but could you talk, like, if the book had been written before the TRC, for example, how would it have been different? And how did the TRC, you can pick another seismic event, but let's use the TRC. How did the fact that you wrote this book after the TRC kind of change your lens on the authorial lens you brought to the book?
That's really interesting, Andrew. I think I was a fool to take it on. So maybe everybody else is a whole lot wiser than I am. It was far more complex than I ever expected. I had written some of it before the TRC. And the book was originally just to be on themes and those societal issues. The publisher who did my book on Pat Martin Bates, Alberta publisher, I sent him what I'd written, and he said, yes, we will publish this, but you've got to do a chronology. It took me a while to write that chronology. When you've lived so much of it, it's very hard to write about the life you've lived, right? Then he sold the publishing company, and I thought this whole book was gone. And it was the U of M Press who came to me. They'd heard from my Alberta friend that it was going, and they were great. How would it have been different without the TRC? There still would have been issues. There would have been the issues of the environmental issues. There would have been issues of health. There would have been issues of human rights. They may have been different issues of human rights. So what the TRC did in the murdered and missing women, it let me pump up all of that. If I was still writing it, I can tell you as a result of being a member of the Canadian delegation that went to COP27 last year in Egypt, when we were told that those of us from the arts could not be in the blue zone, the big blue zone where all the heady and important discussions were held about climate change. So we met off-site. It was an amazing meeting. Then we started petitions, and we were told if we got 75 signatures, we could have a meeting of the arts in the blue zone the last afternoon. Well, it took me an hour to get 75 signatures, and a whole lot of other people were getting signatures too. So if the book hadn't been published yet, I would be adding more on that. The book was almost on the press when Shauna Dempsey and Laurie Milan were part of the bid for the LGBTQ plus monument. So I had them stop press for that. Then the Ukrainian war broke out. So I had them stop press again, and you'll see at the end, there's a half sentence or a sentence where I'm talking about Michael Boss. So it's something that's always going to expand, right? And the third part of your question would have been, why aren't some people in it who should be? And there are people who should have been in there and aren't. There are people who were in there. There were images in there that I had wanted in there, but you know full well a press only has so much money, and they cut me off at 400 and whatever pages, and they cut me off at 270 images. And so you know the kind of debate that goes on with designers, right? So I'm now picking up on some of these threads in my work where I feel the book should have gone further. And I'm asking all of you to write the next volume.
Dana, are there any other questions? Great.
Hello, this question came from online from Jesse, and he or she says, this talk is specifically about Western Canada, but I was wondering if there's any sort of study like this into Northern Canadian art, specifically the territories.
The answer is yes. Darlene White, curator of Inuit art at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, has done some amazing work on Inuit art. And I think I'm not sure whether her latest volume is just out. So the answer is yes. And her work, like mine, is building on what she's done over the decades, as mine was built over my decades of work. But hers is Inuit. I will confess, mine was the 4 Western provinces, right? Save for Joseph Tisika, because I was really interested in the way he portrayed the 60s scoop. There is room for some, maybe that's something I should have included, but I don't know enough about it. And there's another topic that I've been chastised for not being in here. There's an internationally award-winning set designer who's done dance and theater globally. She lives in Victoria. She said, Pat, why aren't I in your book? And I said, because I don't know how to write about theatrical design. That's not my field. So we spent a lot of time together. I've gone over all her portfolios, and I'm trying to find somebody who has the background to be able to write what needs to be written. So I think she understands why I didn't, but it was pointed out as a gap.
Okay, Patrick.
Thanks very much, Pat, for your wonderful talk. Very comprehensive and brought up a lot of ideas. I was thinking about the role of, we'll call it education, but also even maybe counter education. Coming from Western Canada, I know that there was a big influence from, say, British trained teachers in art schools. And at the same time, when we're talking about Indigenous artists, obviously some of them also were trained in art schools, but many were also, of course, developed and trained in their communities and learned from one another. So I wonder, as you went through, I mean, a long period of doing your research over your life, do you have any comments about maybe the positives and negatives of education of artists in Western Canada?
That's really interesting. And there was the odd private art teaching studios in Winnipeg, 1908, 1909. Fitzgerald went to one for a year. He learned from Studio International the year the Winnipeg Public Library opened. He lived close to it, and he was there all the time picking up the international journals. It wasn't just British trained teachers who came to Western Canada. There were a lot of American trained teachers who came up from Canada. There was a real push to get Canadian trained. And that's, I think, why I mentioned that Franz Johnston was the first, well, I didn't mention this, I said he was head of the School of Art. He was the first Canadian artist to be head of the School of Art. Fitzgerald was the first Manitoba artist to be head of the School of Art. And in the 1950s, and particularly in the 1960s, there were more Canadian trained artists. But I think it talks to the paucity of art education across Canada, right? Anywhere. Until the 60s, there weren't that many universities. Look when the colleges really developed. I mean, we've got to look at it holistically. And I think because people like George Swinton, who was trained in Austria, he was a breath of fresh air to these students. But I'm going to say that Hans Hofmann's color theories were brought to the Winnipeg School of Art by William McCloy. And somebody needs to do some work on William McCloy. Honestly, I think that'd be a really interesting exhibition. He was only at the School of Art for a couple of years, but he's the one who really brought the contemporary color theory there. And this is where I think art galleries come in. Clement Greenberg came up in the early 60s and went across the West. His assessment of what he saw was absolutely devastating and demoralizing for a lot of artists. And yet for a few, it was absolutely empowering. For Don Reichert, it was great. And for people like Tony Tascona, it was devastating, right? So they would spend the rest of their career fighting or building on what Clement Greenberg wrote. So that's really interesting to read. Long story short, I think as students, we have to take what's meaningful to us, and may we always be students. And I think we need to challenge what we find not appropriate. And I will say the Winnipeg School of Art, and I think the Vancouver School of Art, and I dare say the others in between, maybe not Saskatchewan so much. Emma Lake and Banff Center provided a whole other kinds of windows for artists. So it wasn't just art school. There were these special opportunities to work with other artists. Barnett Newman came up. Jack Shadbolt actually did the first of the Emma Lake. So I think it's a conglomerate, but for a while, you're right. It was predominantly British and then American. And by that point, we were growing up and we had our own people. Is that a fair answer?
Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this truly illuminating lecture. I immigrated to Canada in my early 30s, and I must say that I didn't know much about Canadian art before coming to Canada. And even now, I would say that Indigenous art is perhaps more known in the world rather than Canadian artists who are not Indigenous. What can we do in order to improve this? I think in many ways one has to come to Canada to truly appreciate some of Canadian art, like the Group of Seven. But it is fantastic. How can we translate it for other people?
I love you for that question. First of all, you're right that Indigenous art until recent years was collected more in Europe than it was in Canada. It's amazing the very early Inuit collections that are in Paris and in Germany. I can tell you the years I was working on the West Coast, the greatest purchasers of Indigenous art were German tourists, and that's what they came for. So what do we do to get non-Indigenous art known? I can tell you that's part of what I'm talking about tomorrow. When I arrived in the Senate, I asked to be on the Foreign Affairs and International Trade Committee because of that reality. And I said, I would like the committee to do a study on cultural diplomacy because a prior government had got rid of all the money for cultural diplomacy, and that cut the legs out of what was beginning to grow. Well, I was told no, it's not important. Well, I kept at it and I was told no and told no. And I thought, geez, I haven't been here very long and I'm being kicked out. My ideas are being kicked out before I begin. Well, a couple of my colleagues said, Pat, keep at it, keep at it. So finally, the chair of the committee said, all right, Senator Bovey, we'll do it. But it'll be a short study. It'll be 2 days. And I thought, for once, Pat, shut up, right? Just say thank you. The study was 1.5 years. And I can tell you when I got the unanimous interest of everybody around that table. The issue was artist resale rights. The report was unanimously adopted by the Senate. The Minister of Global Affairs now has to respond to the report. In fact, yesterday I got a copy of a speech she gave a couple of days ago in Kitchener-Waterloo, and she mentions culture. I haven't dug deeper into it, but maybe we're getting somewhere. So cultural diplomacy in action is really important. But to understand and get the arts on the platform they need to be, and this is part of what we'll talk about in the morning for those who want to come, I need your help. My declaration respecting the essential role of artists and creative expression in Canada, even though it passed the Senate unanimously, even though I had over 600 people working with me across Canada, artists and arts administrators feeding into it, it went to the House of Commons with great support. My sponsor was Jim Carr, former minister, who by this point was no longer a minister, so he could sponsor it. And he was all for it, and it would have passed if he hadn't passed away 1 year ago. And to change a sponsor, you need unanimous consent from all 370 some MPs. 1 voted against it. 6 people asked to sponsor it. So now it's dead in this legislature, in this parliament. And so externally now, we're going to have to get something like it back in the books for a new parliament.
Are there any other last questions for Senator Bovey? We're good. Any other online? No, we're good. Well, Pat, I'm just going to ask you one last question because the most of the room here are full of students, which are our future artists of tomorrow. And Pat has been a tremendous mentor to me for over 20 years, and she's always good for a good pep talk. So I was wondering, Pat, some words of wisdom and advice to our future artists and makers in the audience.
That's a very simple question. I want to say, never lose what's in here. Right? Never lose your voice. Never lose your thoughts, right? Don't pretend to be anybody else in your work. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. I believe artists and scientists are the leaders in any society. You're the ones that are experimenting. You're the ones that see the world 20 years ahead of the rest of us. So don't be afraid not to be part of what you think the in stream is. Always be yourself. Secondly, don't close any doors or windows. You never know when opportunity is going to knock. I had no idea I'd ever end up in the Senate. Imagine how I felt the day the Prime Minister phoned me and said, Pat, we want you in the Senate. You're going to work on everything. You don't have to vote with the government, but I want you to approach everything through the lens of arts and culture. And I'm going to say to those of you artists in the room and those of you writers in the room or whatever you're doing, never lose your own voice and don't be afraid to have your voice, but also don't be afraid to fail. Scientists fail in their experiments all the time and nobody gets down on them. In the art world, because we live on grants, and that's another topic, I don't think we should. I think we should live on investments. But because we live on grants, if we fail, we may not get the next grant. So our lives are based on fear. What if we don't? I want you to be, you're the next generation. I want you to be strong enough that you're not going to be worried about that. You're not going to fail if you're using your own voice. And don't be afraid to talk about your ideas. Don't hide your ideas. Don't guard your research. Don't guard your thoughts. Nobody else can put it out the way you do.
Thank you very much, Pat Bovey. That's been a wonderful, wonderful evening. So for the remind you, we have the books for sale up there. You can see Sarah. Pat will obviously be very, very happy to sign it. There's also some wonderful refreshments that have been provided by Fanshawe College. So with my two hats on, my Fanshawe hat and my Woodstock Art Gallery hat, I want to give a sincere thanks to our Honorable Senator Bovey and to thank you all for coming out this evening. Have a good one.